Welcome to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. On this podcast, we journey through the devastating experience of the death of a child. Grief is seldom discussed openly in our culture, and the death of a child makes people feel even more uncomfortable. We approach the topic openly and honestly, speaking to people who have lost loved ones and experts who help care for them. Whether you are a parent experiencing loss or someone who wants to support another going through this tragedy, this podcast strives to offer hope and help.
Thank you so much, Jen, for coming on the Always Andy's Mom podcast and talking with us today.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this. I think this platform you developed is just amazing. And I've enjoyed and been touched by a lot of the stories that have been shared. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to start out by just talking about what got us together a little bit. So Jen's a fellow Iowan. Yay.
Yeah.
Our Iowans kind of stick together. So it's kind of interesting that my friend Meredith sent me a message a few weeks ago sent us both a message on Facebook Messenger saying, I want to link you guys because I think Jen would be a good guest for you. I think we both graduated from the same college. We both graduated from Luther College. Jen, you were a couple of years apart from us. Were you a year or two?
I think a year. I graduated
from Meredith
in 95. I think you guys were 96.
We were 96. Yeah.
Okay.
So she was a year ahead of the two of us, but you played softball with my friend Meredith. And she said, I think you guys should get together. And what's funny is that Jen wrote back and said, well, actually, I know all about Marcy because my friend Sarah introduced me to her podcast a long time ago.
Yeah.
And Sarah, another Iowa girl that I went to high school with. So Sarah and Meredith don't know each other at all. So one I went to college with, one I went to high school with 100 miles away. And so Sarah had already introduced the podcast, and she had sent me a message a couple of years ago now, I think, saying, I've given your podcast information out to friends, didn't say who you were. But anyway, it all came full circle to lead us back together. So I just think it shows what a small world is. And, I told my husband this and he's like, that's just the way Iowa is. Iowans just know each other. It's not that big of a state.
I know. And sometimes I feel like it's Luther, but I'm that kind of person too, I think, that just kind of seeks out that small world experience. It drives my kids nuts because I'm always having conversations with people just randomly, one-on-one. And they're like, come on, Mom, we got to go. And I'm like, just a minute. So I'm always trying to make a connection. Some people probably get annoyed by it, but it's amazing sometimes, what can come about just a simple conversation. And a lot of people know about Luther. A lot of people, know someone from the Midwest. Every once in a while I'll be asked if I'm from Idaho, or, is that
right?
They do the potatoes.
Is that the potato state? No,
yeah. No, it's
Idaho's the potato state. Iowa's the corn state. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and of course you were in Decorah, and it's a very pretty area of Iowa. So it's got the River Valley, and they call it kind of the little Switzerland. So I always have to tell people, it's not like a lot of the rest of Iowa. It's very picturesque, and I didn't appreciate that.
Yeah, I remember going to visit with my mom, and we were driving in from the highway going to campus, and there are these limestone bluffs on the left side. And she said, "Oh, Marcy, this is going to be the place." And it was.
Yeah,
it was. It was just from that very first little image. It's just such a gorgeous place. And I know when we were there, I don't know if you remember this, but it was voted the prettiest place in America to watch a football game because our football stadium overlooked those limestone bluffs. And in the fall with all the beautiful leaves, it's just breathtaking. So,
And ironically, I've spent many years since I was little in that stadium because my dad was the football coach there for many years. So
you would definitely have known when that vote came out. I remember you telling me that.
Yeah.
Because
So
I
that
think
place
your
is
dad probably tried to recruit my brother, because my brother almost went there and was going to play football. He was all going to play football. And then my mom died and he just didn't have the heart to be able to do it anymore. So he didn't go, but that would have been right around the time that your dad, I think, retired. So
yeah. Yeah. Oh, I know. It is
now a lot of funny connections that you all are getting to hear about. And now you all are going to have to look up Decorah, Iowa and Luther College, but we should get on to the subject at hand a little bit more and talk about your son, Brendan.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'll just start out and kind of take it from when he was born. It was a true small world experience. So kind of taking away a little bit of Luther connection as well. I was living up in Minneapolis with my husband, Brendan's dad at the time. We're now divorced, but he was going to chiropractic school up there. And so we were living there. I was working as a nurse. And it was a Sunday morning and my water broke. And, the first time mom, you're just kind of like, oh, do we go? We don't want to wait too long after your water broke. You hear different things about all that. Right. So we decided to head to the hospital, and we get there, and my labor moves along, and by mid-afternoon, I'm in active labor, and I'm kind of kneeling on the bed over a birth ball, and as my contraction finishes, the new nurse enters the room, and it was change of shift about 3:30 or so, and she introduced herself. Hi, I'm Lynn. I'm going to be your nurse for the rest of the night. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Do you need anything? Kind of looked at the monitor and everything. And then she stared at me for a minute and she said, you look an awful lot like my kindergarten teacher. And I had the wherewithal in active labor to say, well, my mom taught kindergarten for 36 years in Decorah, like 2.5 hours south of there. And she said, Mrs. Naisland. And I said, yeah, that's my mom. So here was this nurse who was bringing Brendan into this world, who had my mom as her kindergarten teacher, Brendan's grandma. And so after Brendan was born, we called my parents, they drove up. And it was just a very special reunion of sorts. She only lived in Decorah through her kindergarten year. So she moved away. Her dad worked at Luther, actually. So to remember the face of your kindergarten teacher that you didn't see after kindergarten was just amazing to me once I was able to kind of think about it.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then years later,
I know. And then years later, my daughter ended up being best friends with her niece because her sister lived in Decorah, and they are in Arizona right now, going to the same college and still best friends. So I still have a connection to that nurse. So that Brendan came in, making it a small world experience. And there were so many small world experiences while he lived. And now I'm having so many like ours, after his passing. So it makes me smile. It makes me cry, but it's the joy of it all. So just very special the way he kind of came into the world that way. So yeah, that was very special. But, he was a very healthy boy, our first one. And of course, we're attentive to him. And we lived in the cities for about another year. And then we moved to Decorah. My husband at the time wanted to come back to Decorah and start his own chiropractic business. So we moved. I left the job that was pretty stable. So I had some uncertainty, but we both wanted to get back to our families where the grandparents were. Brendan was the first of my family's grandchildren. He was my first child, obviously, my only son. And we moved back to Decorah where we knew it was a beautiful place to be, great place to grow your kids, start a business and all of that stuff. So we came back and really just had good neighbors. We had high school classmates that were neighbors for a while, and they had a daughter that was 3 weeks actually younger than Brendan. So they got along really well. We learned early on that Brendan was very passive, tender-hearted little boy. He had these big brown eyes, and he was my only child that had my brown eyes. I had brown-haired girls, but no brown eyes. They all had hazel eyes. And now I have another daughter too, and she's got hazel eyes too. So he's my brown-eyed boy. Big cheeks. His one set of grandparents lived on a farm, so he loved being on the farm, loved getting dirty, loved getting his hands dirty. Just a very calm, tender-hearted little boy. Slept well, didn't really cause a lot of problems, was never really sick. So just kind of a great first kid, to have.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, he nursed well, he ate well. 2 years later, I had my daughter Josie, and then 2.5 years later after that, I had my daughter Maya. So we quickly added to the group here, and then everything started to be a blur. So you could ask me something about Brendan when he was like 4, 5, or 6, and I'd be like, I don't know. I had an infant and a toddler I was potty training, and then so poor Brendan. But so yeah, kind of fast forward into elementary and kind of middle school. As he entered into 4th grade, he turned 10 years old. And it was late October when we got a call from his school nurse. And she said, his teacher has noticed that Brendan's been staring off in school, and she is concerned and has some certainty that these might be a type of seizure. And so a few days later, we already had a pre-planned or scheduled parent-teacher conference. So my husband and I went in and we sat down and talked to her, and he was doing very well in school. So it wasn't really affecting his school, but she had a daughter that was diagnosed with epilepsy in her early 20s. And I think she was thinking maybe she might have had some of these that they didn't pick up on or diagnose earlier. So she actually was very well familiar with seizures, what they looked like, the various types of them. And so we were very grateful for that she was able to identify that, because I don't know if other teachers would have thought maybe he was just bored or just, had some sort of attention deficit disorder.
Well, I can think that they might not bring it up either, because you and your husband at the time were both medical people. So it may have almost been a little intimidating to even bring it up for her.
Right.
So
yeah, I guess I never even thought about that, but
I think that's amazing that she did bring it up.
Yeah, it's very courageous of her to kind of,
it really was.
It's kind of a bold thing to tell somebody that they think their child might be having seizures. It's not something a parent
especially when you're a nurse and Dad's a chiropractor, and I don't know. I just think that was a brave thing to do.
Yeah. So we're very grateful. And I actually met her daughter through networking with the Epilepsy Foundation through our walks and stuff. She was on a Zoom meeting one day, and I saw her name pop up, and then last name you don't hear very often. And I thought that's got to be her. And so in the Zoom meeting with all these people, we kind of made this personal connection. So we're having this conversation while everybody's listening. And I'm like, your mom was my son's teacher, and she was the one that did. So just kind of another small world, kind of full circle event that he's been a part of. So yeah. So after that, we kind of monitored him, and we kind of noticed a few more things happening with him at home, where he'd be walking and then just stop. And then kind of a few seconds later, he'd just start walking again, pick up his conversation. But 3 months after that, I was on a connecting flight out of Houston, Texas to Panama City for a mission trip through church. We were going down to put water catchment systems for clean water for the village people down off of Bocas del Toro. And my husband called and said, Brendan just had at the time they called him grand mal seizure. They call him tonic-clonics now. And during his sleep, it happened about 4 o'clock that morning. And he said, what should we do? Do I need to take him to the emergency room? We kind of suspected that this was probably another type of, we knew it was another type of seizure. We knew he'd already had some of these small absent seizures. So I said, is he resting? Is he doing okay? Has he had more? And he said, no, it was just that one. And he is sleeping right now. I said, let him rest. Try and get a hold of our primary care doctor and get some direction maybe from him. And if he wants to see him Monday. So we got him started on medication, and we got that kind of catapulted us into getting an MRI, getting on the books scheduled with the neurologist, which takes, it took about 3 months to get into them. And during that whole time, the medication wasn't working. The side effects were horrible. He was having seizures every day of various types, absence seizures. He was having seizures every night in his sleep. And this went on for weeks through into the summer. Switched him on his meds, and then finally got to the neurologist at the end of the summer before school started, switched him up to Decorah. And within a matter of a couple of weeks, his seizures were under control, and he didn't have anything that we could tell or see, just in time for him to start 5th grade and turn 11 years old. And he was so excited. We were so excited. The summer he was away from school, I worked from home, so we had a nanny. So we had some control. Like I was around a little bit. So if something happened, I could be there to kind of somewhat monitor him. But then going to school, sending him to school, back to his peers, there's that stigma around seizures and epilepsy. And I felt I didn't know what to do. I didn't know anybody that had epilepsy. I didn't even know we had a foundation in Iowa. So I was not connecting with other moms. I didn't have anyone that reached out to me. I didn't get any resources. We doctored in Wisconsin and we live in Iowa. So there was no connection to anything local. And when his seizures came under control with one medication, I didn't think it was a big deal. I thought, here we go. He's going to outgrow them and life is going to be good. So he proceeded through the years and did very well in school. He'd had no side effects that we could tell with the medication he was on. He was able to do pretty much any activity. His neurologist basically said, you won't be able to be an Air Force pilot. You shouldn't do rock climbing or, things at heights. You shouldn't do deep sea diving. And, you won't be able to be semi truck driver. But for the most part, you can do almost anything. And if your seizures stay under control, you can continue driving. And so we were very optimistic. And he went 3.5 years without a seizure. And 13 months of that, he was off his medication. So when he was 14, it was the end of February. He went to a friend's house and had a sleepover. And his seizures were always triggered by sleep deprivation or lack of sleep or sleep interruption. And sure enough, that sleepover, they had Mountain Dew, caffeine, played video games. He came home, slept that morning, and through the afternoon, we got him up to go have an early dinner. And all of a sudden I heard this thud on the floor. And then you hear that sound, that moaning kind of sound that they make during a seizure. And there he was laying on the floor of the room he was resting in. And this seizure was different. He was tracking, his eyes were tracking with me, where usually his seizures had been where he didn't know what was going on. And I talked to him the whole time. I turned him to his side, make sure he's, his head is comfortable and he's safe. And as soon as he came out of it, his hands went right to his face and he just started sobbing. And he never shared with me what that emotion meant, but I knew it meant I'm no longer normal. I have to take my meds again. I have to deal with this condition again. I won't be able to get my driver's permit. And I could just imagine, I wish I could go back and talk to him about the emotion of that. I never did. I never asked him once about, how do you feel about having epilepsy? It was all about the control of the seizures. And that was always the goal. Brendan, our goal with you with treatment is to make sure you don't have another seizure. There was never a mental health component, which I think is maybe a lot in chronic diseases. There was no talk about mortality, because who wants to talk about that in any disease, And so we felt, though, that we could bring care closer to home. We had been going all the way to Milwaukee, which was 4 to 5 hours away. So we got a little bit closer to La Crosse, Wisconsin, and started up with a pediatric neurologist now, got him back on his meds. And fast forward, he had a few breakthrough seizures, but he accelerated everything he did. He worked very hard. He was such a hard worker. And that's one of the repeated things that people say about him, both when he was alive and now, after his passing. But he was able to participate in sports. He played football. He ran track. He wrestled a few years, gave that up. Eventually, after his sophomore, he played baseball. He did all these things despite having his epilepsy. He accelerated in school. After his 9th grade year, he had one of his science teachers that said, you know what, Brendan, you're really good at math and science and putting those things together. That's the makeup of somebody that is a good engineer or could be a good engineer. And that was his kind of light bulb moment where he kind of went on that track. Then I'm going to be an engineer. But he didn't want to be an engineer that sat in a cube and just was on a computer, analyzing data and doing all of that. His idea of engineering was probably working at John Deere and holding a wrench in his hand, getting his hands greasy. When he got into high school, he had a couple of friends that did dirt track race car driving, and he'd be down there in the pit crew helping him out. And that was his kind of mechanical engineering. And so that's what he wanted to pursue. So he put his mind to it. There were a couple exploratory kind of classes that they brought into the high school with engineering. And so he jumped right into those, and they made all these little different robotic things. And I was amazed the way that he could get through a physics class, or the way he made calculus look easy. He wasn't good with words on paper, but to put an equation down and fill a page with numbers and equations and things that were so foreign to me, I mean, it was no problem to him. And to think back that how epilepsy and medications of any type, whatever you're, suffering from, have all these side effects that can inhibit some of that growth, brain growth, cognitive development. I mean, that nothing seemed to affect him that way. And so that made his condition seem even more like, gosh, he is going to thrive despite this. And I used to tell people, I'm just fortunate that my son doesn't have terminal cancer, because he should be able to manage this condition for the rest of his life. So now I look back and think, gosh, was I so wrong?
Right.
Anyways, I know I was sharing with you that the springtime is kind of a difficult time for me, because in his senior year, it's kind of when you go through all that recognition. I know you're approaching what would have been Andy's senior year too. And I feel, my heart, all the different moments where they recognize the children. And I hope, the class, Andy's class, will do something for him, because, he would deserve that. But and so there's all these moments.
It's hard to know, because he only did orientation. He never was a part of that.
Oh, yeah. But all these moments that lift and catapult these young adults into their next phase, like this independence, whether they go on to the military, they go on to a trade school, they go on to university or college, or they go on to work. This is kind of their send off, and the last kind of little bit of hey, way to go. You've done great these last 12 years, and Brendan had a lot of those moments. He worked so hard for a lot of that stuff. He did very well in football. He got an academic all-state recognition in football. And he also got an academic all-state recognition in track. And so you have to qualify for the state track meet to do that. You have to have a 28 or higher ACT score, and you have to have a 3.8 or higher GPA. So, he was thriving, and he was a good friend. He was just a good kid too. He had a good head on his shoulders. He wasn't perfect. He would mess up, and, we'd let him learn from that. But he had to grow into and be responsible to taking medication twice a day, getting his sleep. He was always in bed by 10 o'clock. He'd come home from his practices, and he'd sit right at the dining room table and do his homework. And I'd have to set the table around him, because he knew he wanted to get his homework done, so he wasn't staying up late doing it. And then there were times when I said, hey, Brendan, are you at a good spot to just stop, put your homework down? We're going to eat now. So we'd eat, and then all my kids would clear their plates. And one thing that touches me so much about Brendan, and this speaks to the kindness and humbleness that he had, every time he stood up and went to take his plate away from the table, he looked directly at me and said, thank you, Mom, for supper. And I always thought, you know what? I think there are so many people that that's a given to them, or that they don't even enjoy sitting around a table and enjoying their family. And for him to acknowledge both the meal that he was given, that we prepared, and the time that we just spent together, that meant the world to me. And it means even more to me today, knowing that was what was in his heart each time he just had that simple meal and sat with us for those. It could have been just 15 minutes.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's beautiful.
And then he'd pick back up and do his homework. So But he'd have his 4-year-old, my daughter at the time was 4 years old, Ivy. I got remarried. And so Ivy is from my second marriage, and she's 10 years younger than my next oldest child. My girls, yeah. So, but fast forward. So Brendan, we got through graduation. He actually received a scholarship that was for engineering, and it was in memory and in the spirit of the life of a Decorah graduate who had died at the age of 30 from stomach cancer. And he went on to go to Iowa State, and he was an engineer. And the company that he was a partner with, along with his family, developed this scholarship. And it was a pretty good sized scholarship. You had to apply for it. You had to write an essay, which wasn't Brendan's strong suit. And they then picked the recipient. And it wasn't revealed until that end of everyone's received their scholarships. We have like the dollars for scholars, like a lot of schools do, where you have criteria for various scholarships, and then the computer picks. Well, this scholarship, the family and the company picked, and it was announced after everybody else. So nobody knew. And when Brendan's name was announced, it was just like, I was so proud of him, because I knew, one, he wasn't a strong writer. So that essay must have, he must have done, to bring across this point. And then afterwards, we were out in the hallway and we were taking pictures, and it was so bittersweet, because all I could think about was what this mom had lost, and now what my son was getting because of that loss. And I did not have the words to thank her, because that loss is so monumental that, it just seemed like insignificant. And so I remember talking to Brendan after that night and saying, this is a very special scholarship, not because of the money, but because of the meaning behind it. A mother has lost her child, and now you have been given this gift to help you further your education in an area where her son thrived. Little did I know, a year later, I would be giving a scholarship in Brendan's memory at the next scholarship night, because 6 months later, Brendan died in his sleep following a seizure when he was at college. And, just very unexpected. He was at Iowa State at the time. We were so excited for him to go to school. He made such great friends when he went. And we just I was beside myself at how well he was doing at school. Unfortunately, 3 weeks before he was set to go to college, leave for school, he had a breakthrough seizure. He had been woken at night by a friend to come pick him up at a party. Brendan was that kind of guy. And I've learned that he was the one that took care of a lot of people. He was like the big brother of the group, and made sure everybody got to where they needed to be safely, and that they were kept safe. Came back to bed. His friend went to the other room and fell asleep. And that early that morning, I heard another thud. He'd fallen out of bed, and he was having another seizure. This was the first one in over 14 months. So it'd been over 14 months, and he was still on his medication. Ironically, we were set to see his neurologist the next week. So we waited and we talked to him about that. And on our ride to the appointment, it was an hour. I was talking to him about all these things that we need to do. We need to get your medication transferred. We need to talk to him about accommodations, so you don't have your bed lofted. You can be at a lower level so you don't fall out of bed. And I remember Brendan turning to me. He's like, "Mom, you don't have to worry about me. I'll be fine." And so we sat in that appointment and talked about all the things that he needs to look out for. And, he was 19. He didn't need to have me in the appointment, but he wanted me there. He needed my support, and I'm glad he did. His neurologist was great and loved Brendan. Our last words from him were, "I'm excited to see you in 6 months and see how well your first semester of college is going." And unfortunately, the next time I saw his neurologist was at Brendan's celebration of life 4 months later. So it's just crazy how life can just, and this with Andy, just like that.
Just change on a dime. Yeah.
Yeah. And the days before Brendan died, he died on a Tuesday, November 28th, 2017. We had just celebrated Thanksgiving. that Thursday before. We were in Omaha. We would go there every other Thanksgiving and spend time with my brother-in-law, my husband's brother. And Brendan was a huge Iowa Hawkeye fan growing up. And so once he went to Iowa State,
and then he went to Iowa State.
Yeah, we were like, wow. And I was kind of proud of him because, you didn't follow like what everybody thought you were going to do. You did something outside of the box. And that right there, that decision right there showed me that Brendan was willing to take a risk. He was willing to risk being at the rival school, the rival state school, his Iowa Hawkeyes, and just to risk, like a lot of his friends were going to Iowa, a lot of Decorah people went to Iowa, and he was going to Iowa State. So I was proud of him, and I loved Iowa State. It's like a little hometown down there. It's like a bigger Luther campus. They've got all the beautiful buildings. And when I went down there with a visit for him, I'm like, I know why he thinks this is where he belongs. Yeah. So, yeah. And we are so grateful. He had so many great friends that he actually was kind of the catalyst in bringing together. His friends will share that he was friends with a group and in another group and kind of brought them all together. And they actually pulled together and had this co-ed flag football team for the homecoming that fall of their freshman year. And he was the captain and the coach. And they had a friend from India named Tareth, and they called him Mr. T. So the name of their team was Mr. T and the Fools. And they had these stone gray t-shirts with all their names. And they had, it's like a fist pump, we pity the fool. And they got second place. They got a little second place trophy. And after Brendan died, his friends brought that to us, and we have it sitting in his room on what was his room on his dresser still, as a symbol of that team. Because that team, that Mr. T and the Fools, has been such a blessing to us, even ongoing. We connect with them still, almost 4.5 years later. They've all graduated from college by now, and they're all doing their own thing. They're all across the country, but we still keep in touch with them. And we know those are relationships I need to hold close to my heart. And because they were the people that knew Brendan in this new independent next kind of phase of his life.
Right. That was just a few months, but
yeah. I mean, and they did that day he passed away. One of his friends came up to me and says, I know we only knew Brendan for 105 days, but we made connections and made friendships that are going to last a lifetime beyond. And to me, that is like, that hit me. So they're called the ISU 105 group too, because they had 105 days with him. And it was just just a small snippet of what Brendan, I know, was going to be able to do in life, bringing people together, excelling. He, excelled with his academics. About 2 weeks before he passed away, he just texted me and said, hey, Mom, I've declared my major within engineering, because he was thinking of chemical engineering or mechanical. And he says, I'm going to do mechanical. So he had just declared. He was ready to sign up for his second semester classes. He was just finishing up a chemistry class that he thought he needed to take, and it was hard, but now turns out he wasn't doing chemical engineering, so he really didn't need it. So he kind of took it and, didn't need it, but he was kind of that way about a challenge too. Like he faced it head on, just like he did with his epilepsy. And it wasn't until he passed away that his English teacher in a composition class his senior year sent me his portfolio of writings. And of course, I've said to you, he's not a very strong writer, and so that was an awesome class for him to take. And she's an amazing teacher. And one of his writings, essays in there, was titled Disability. And he talked about his epilepsy. He didn't talk necessarily about his seizure types, the medication, the medical aspect of it, but he talked about the emotional. And he talked about how when I dropped him off that first day of school going to 5th grade and he got out of the van, how he felt like he was a fish out of water. He didn't know if people were going to remember all the weird faces and the staring and the mouth movements and all of that he did in class, and what they would think of him. If they would think he was weird, if they would not want to be his friend. And I never once talked to him about that side of this with him. And so when I read
what a
that,
gift to be able to have. Yeah.
Yeah, I just was, oh my gosh, Brendan, you are sharing your heart with me. Now you've been gone, almost a year. And it just, he gave a speech about his epilepsy. He wrote that essay, and he had to share it with some of his classmates. So he was just starting the second part of his senior year in high school to accept that he was not going to outgrow this, and sharing it with people and having that courage and just like, this is a part of me. This is a part of who I am. And I'm going to accept that. And I'm going to take it on, and I'm going to live, and I'm going to do a lot of great things despite it. Mm-hmm. So that portfolio is very special to us, and I'm reread it. And but it is a lot of just the emotion about what it's like to have epilepsy and the stigma. And it's not something that we ever focused on, because with as infrequent as Brendan's seizures occurred, we knew of 5 seizures that he had from the time he was 11, when his seizures got under control, to the seizure that took his life on November 28th, 2017. 5 seizures in 9 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And what took his life is something called SUDEP, and we had never heard of it. So in his passing, there's a lot of work and advocacy that I've done, both with the Epilepsy Foundation and a foundation called Danny Did. So I just find different ways that I can carry Brendan. I always kind of have to speak and pray about, would he be proud of this? Is this what he would want to be known and be a part of? Uh-huh. And the work I do is always in helping others, whether that's in support, fundraising, just kind of bringing something to better someone else's life, or hopes that this would at some point not happen to somebody else. Unfortunately, it probably happens every day, and all too frequently. So, I do what I can in his memory to not only help in my grief with that, but to help others with that. So it's been, that's been a big part of my healing journey, is just to be able to give back to those organizations in his memory, and to help others that are affected and living with epilepsy. Because not all of them had it, I don't want to say easy like Brendan, but you probably know with your work that there are kids that have epilepsy and people that have epilepsy, and they are on 4 or 5 different medications, multiple seizures still a day. They have other disabilities that they either affect their mobility or their cognitive, space.
Absolutely.
So yeah. So
there are
in that
so
aspect,
many
I'm
different
very
stories.
grateful. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes down to it, I just think of how much strength and bravery and courage that Brendan really lived with, that he maybe didn't even realize.
Yeah.
And if he knew what could have happened to him because of a seizure, gosh, I don't know how that would have changed his thinking, his doing.
Yeah.
He was always very good about taking his medication. Like I said, he was always very good. There's a lot of self-management that comes with that. And he was always very good about that. Very disciplined with that. So yeah, just something that just.
Well, and it's so hard too, when you feel like there's just not a good explanation. I think that's a thing that we kind of want as mothers, you want to know kind of why. And this is one that, why, and that he had a seizure, but you don't know why too, right? It's that, why was this the seizure that took his life when the other 4 didn't? And other people, like you say, can have easily 5, 6 seizures every single day and have it not take their life. So it's just such a hard thing to wrap your head around. And I've talked to lots of people now with who have had children die of SUDEP. And I always, and most of them had never heard of it. I don't know that any of them had ever heard of it really before. And most of them tell me that they don't think they would have even wanted to know about this as being a possibility. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think the conversations would have been much different. And with Brendan being 19, the first time that we were ever told that, or somebody said to us that, these types of seizures he has at nighttime and the tonic-clonic can be very fatal, was a nurse practitioner at the Milwaukee Children's Hospital. And it really kind of upset me because Brendan was 11 at the time and he was in the room, and she just flat out said, these seizures can be deadly. They can be the most deadly. And I'm like, okay, we could have maybe filtered that a little bit and not said that right in front of Brendan, but that was all that was said and never elaborated on. I was just kind of like taken aback. So I never really asked a lot more questions. I just thought, okay, well, it probably is unwitnessed. They could suffocate, they could choke, if somebody's not there to position them. And, but I was just kind of upset that they said that right in front of Brendan. I don't think he didn't understand what they, were talking about necessarily, but that was the only time that they really said anything about that. One of the foundations I work with does work with providers to provide them with information, so that kind of bridging that gap of communication. So when parents, have a situation where someone may be at more risk, they'd feel more comfortable talking about that. And then there's always technology that they're trying.
And I do think that's important too, especially when there's something that you can do about it, like surgical options and things like that. So certainly I had a patient not too long ago that was told that they were at higher risk and that surgery could be an option, but they were very worried about, side effects of surgery. Sometimes very, very bad side effects like blindness and things like that. And
I know.
But it was nice that I was so well versed in SUDEP that it didn't throw me for a loop, that I felt like I could help that family and give that family a little bit of guidance on that choice. When I feel like, honestly, probably a lot of general pediatricians wouldn't have. And I don't know if before I did the podcast, if I would have been able to, well, I'm certain I wouldn't have been able to counsel them in the same way after having met so many families who've lost their kids.
Yeah. And I know there's always
that's good or bad, because obviously I have a very skewed sense of much higher of the rates of SUDEP than they actually are, of course, right? Because when I interview people, their children have died. So it's hard. We were just on a little trip and I was talking to my son about somebody, and I said, well, I was talking to her son died, and he's like, yeah, everybody you talk to, their kid has died. Like, yeah, I know. That's now so many of my friends are in this same world, even though it's still rare.
Yeah. And I know one of the foundations I work with is really trying to get the technology kind of industry moving. And there's a couple of things, there's one or two that are FDA approved for seizure detection, but of course they monitor just gross motor movement a lot of the times, but there are things that can connect to smartphones and just kind of alert. So it's not perfect and it's not 100%, but it can be a very good part of a treatment plan. And the best way to avoid that from happening is just seizure control. And unfortunately, I think there's upwards of 30% of people with epilepsy do not obtain seizure control. And that's the biggest risk. Every seizure, especially in the tonic-clonic, is a risk for something to happen, whether it be that or an accident or accidental drowning or, anything like that. So, or a status situation. So, So I think, just finding hopefulness in my story, especially when I talk to other families with epilepsy, it's not always the best segue to say, hey, my son had epilepsy, but he died, so just finding ways that, and outlets that I can help use my voice and create some of that hope. And I feel like I've been able to do that in Brendan's memory through these two foundations. And my daughter's gotten involved, Ivy's gotten involved, and, in giving and fundraising. So that's been a really great opportunity for her. I want her, as we know, as our kids grow older, they're going to develop through their grief, and as their developmental capacity can embrace that. And I want her to have a community of people that she can go for resources and a better understanding of what actually happened to Brendan, along with, church community, family community, that kind of thing. So it's been a real blessing for us to have her in her, she's only 8 years old, to kind of be surrounded by, she sees people that look different. They're in wheelchairs. They are, they don't speak. They have different ways of communicating. So she's being exposed to a lot of other people that have various disabilities, and, working to support them. So that's pretty special for us too.
So talk to us a little bit about those two foundations and kind of what your role has been in both of those.
Yeah. So my first encounter with the Epilepsy Foundation of Iowa, when Brendan passed away, his roommate found him that afternoon, and they suspect that he had died hours earlier during a nap in the morning. His roommate came back from class, and Brendan was still in bed, and found him, and he tried to administer CPR, but Brendan, he had been gone a very long time. So very traumatic kind of experience for a 18, 19-year-old to find their roommate, unresponsive. And then, of course, he was in the dorm room, and a lot of his neighboring, around the people that were on his floor were his friends. And so they were a part of seeing all of them, him being wheeled out in the stretcher, in this body bag. And I think one of the first things after we were notified by the police officers in Decorah, they came to our door that night, and we were just getting ready. My daughters and I'm kind of regressing here, but my daughters and I were getting ready to go on a trip to New York. And so we had just booked our hotel in Minneapolis because we were going to leave on a flight at 5 a.m. So we wanted to stay overnight, park our car there. And I just shut my computer down from booking the hotel, and got a knock on our front door. And there stood two Decorah police officers. And the one said to me, "Are you Brendan's mom?" And I said, "Yes." And I thought, oh gosh, did he get in a car accident? Did he get in trouble? And I knew he was at school. And he said, "I'm so sorry, your son passed away today." And I just went to my knees. Yeah. I didn't start crying immediately. I went to my knees, and then my husband knelt down. I sat on his knee, and I was just in disbelief. I didn't even start crying. I don't think I cried for another hour. I just couldn't believe. All I could muster, my oldest daughter was with my youngest in the back room, and they kind of peeked around the corner, and my husband sent him upstairs to go be with Maya, and didn't say much, but they knew something was happening. And all I wanted to do was shut that door and have them come back and say, "You know what, we just made a big mistake. It wasn't your son."
Right.
And they didn't know a lot about what had happened, because the Ames police, where Iowa State is, had just notified them, the investigator, and said, here's a number they can call, and we'll give them more details. So they had no idea what had happened. And they came in the door, and they stood for a while. And I remember the first thing, and I think sadness brings you a lot of guilt. And that was my first response. I said to them, "I am so sorry that this is something you have to do." Telling a mom that you lost your child. That was my first thought. Mm-hmm. And because I didn't know what else to think. So they left, and we proceeded to make our contacts and kind of find out more. But then we needed to get a hold of people because, with social media, his friends right there, we didn't want anyone to find out through any of that. So I have a very hard time reliving and talking about the next 2 hours. We had to call his girlfriend. We had to tell his sisters. We had to tell his grandparents, his family. And all along, I kept thinking my son is somewhere in a cold bag in a medical examiner's room, and I'm not with him.
Yeah.
And I knew I didn't want to go see him because that was not him anymore. His life had left his body, and I wasn't about to go kneel on a floor in a medical examiner's, room and be with my son. So I had to talk myself down, and, he was an organ donor, and of course with his brown eyes, and they said, he could donate his corneas. I know the irises are part of the ones that make the color, but it was kind of a little sliver of silver lining. So I was on the phone for 45 minutes shortly after with the organ donating interviewer. And, answering all these very personal questions about Brendan. Was he sexually active? Was he a drug user? Was he this, that, and I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, these are intense, but no, that I knew of. And it turned out that they couldn't draw enough blood. So they weren't able to harvest his skin or his bones or his corneas or anything to use to donate. So the next morning I got that call, and that was kind of disappointing, but yeah. So anyways, getting back to the foundation, his roommate's mom, which was very special, started the team for our epilepsy walk that following spring. And that kind of catapulted me into connecting with the foundation, the executive director. And then a year later, she introduced me, or she said, you need to get in contact with the Danny Did Foundation. So I started connecting with them. I'd been volunteering at the epilepsy walks in Iowa, at the remembrance tables and things like that. And so I had already kind of gotten my feet grounded on a little bit of support, and what that looks like, how I was able to absorb that and kind of fit that into my own grief. And so I saw that the Danny Did Foundation was taking in team members for the Chicago Marathon, which is one of their big fundraisers. And I have run marathons in the past. And so I thought, okay, that's interesting, or it's, it kind of gets me interested. But then the time frame to sign up passed, and I thought, okay, well, decision's made. And then they extended the deadline. So I asked my husband, I said, would you support me if I ran a marathon? And he said, well, I thought you were never going to run a marathon again. And I said, well, here's what it would be for. And he said, absolutely. And within 5 minutes, he had a training schedule pulled up for me. And I ran my first marathon with Danny Did in 2019. And when I made my first call to Danny is a 4-year-old boy who died from SUDEP 10 years earlier, and his family had started this foundation to bring awareness. His uncle was the executive director, so he was my first phone call. And when you have that listening heart, he's been through this as an uncle of somebody who was lost in the same way as Brendan. And from there, I just felt like such a heartfelt connection that I knew I needed to be a part of that foundation. Today, I'm on the board of directors for both the Epilepsy Foundation of Iowa. I'm the SUDEP ambassador for Iowa. So I have the opportunity to connect with other bereaved families across the state that have similar losses, and work with researchers. Like at the University of Iowa, they have a huge SUDEP research team. So that's been fun to kind of get involved with kind of finding out why this happens. And then also I'm on the board of directors now too with the Danny Did Foundation. So that's been kind of my heart work in memory of Brendan. And I love both teams I work with and all the people that I get to meet nationally that are affected by this condition. And it's pretty amazing, very bittersweet. But I'm 4.5
give
years.
it a little bit of purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I don't know how much time we have left, but I was going to share, I went to New York. So we canceled our trip. We ended up making the trip a year later, the girls and I. But I went to New York that spring in 2018, right after our first epilepsy walk. I had 2 girlfriends from college or from high school that I went with. And I walked through Central Park, and there were these beautiful pink trees that were blooming. And I thought they were like crabapple trees. I mean, I'm from the Midwest. I don't know. Yeah. And I got closer, and they were these huge, beautiful, like a ton of trees, all blooming. They were magnolias, pink magnolia trees. Didn't know that. Well, it just so happened that very day, that morning, my parents and my daughter Ivy were down at Iowa State. His friends were planting a pink flowering magnolia tree in front of his dorm at Iowa State. And my parents were down there to be part of the dedication. Wow. And here I am walking through Central Park with these beautiful magnolia trees everywhere. And I just sat there and I just watched people walk by, and I looked at these beautiful trees, and I just imagined how beautiful that tree was going to become outside of his dorm in a few years. And yeah.
We have a little magnolia tree. I mean, it's getting me teary-eyed because we have a little magnolia tree behind our house up north. And of course, it blooms right around his birthday every year because his birthday is at the end of April. But the weird thing about this magnolia tree, and I don't know, maybe there are other magnolia trees that do this. I've never seen one that does this, but our magnolia tree also will bloom about 10 or 15 blooms also in the middle of August. And it has always done this. And it was always just a few, just a handful that it is in the middle of August. And I don't know really why it does it. I don't know. Is that common? Do you know?
I don't know, but for Mother's Day, the following year, my husband bought me 6 magnolia. They came like just bare root, and we planted them all over, but they're starting to do the same thing because we're now kind of getting into the 3rd year. And that's kind of when they really start to, but yeah, they do. We'll see little buds, and it won't, like you said, it's not many, but it
doesn't a lot, but it doesn't. And what's crazy is, so Andy died on August 15th. And so so that magnolia tree blooms for his birthday, and then it blooms again, just a little bit around his heaven day.
Special. I know, it just definitely a sign, a God wink, a shoulder tap, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
And maybe all magnolia trees do that. It sounds like maybe they do, but it just seems a little special, at least for this one.
Well,
that it does.
How would you have known? How would you have known?
No,
not planted
it. Because you're right.
Whether they all do it or not, you would have never known.
Iowa.
Yeah.
But we're just a little bit further east in Michigan, and we've got them. So
yeah. Well, I know when we talked a couple weeks ago, I could not end our conversation without showing gratitude for both of our children, and the love that we have for them, the love that's driven you to this amazing platform, to be kind of a speaking point for just a lot of grieving families and people listening and everything. And I am so honored to be able to be a part of it. But, we would not be sitting here today if it weren't for our children, if it weren't for Andy, and if it weren't for Brendan. And I know we would, hands down, we wouldn't want to be here today. But just, with our circumstances, I'm grateful that our sons have brought us together here, and that the love of your son has given you this platform and your voice to really help people heal.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today, Jen.
Yeah.
And I just look forward to seeing all that you're going to be able to accomplish too.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to listening to all of your podcasts. I know it's bittersweet because that means, moms are, or dads are losing their children, obviously, but it does help when you hear other people's stories and you hear how they're moving on, whether they're going on to teach yoga or do different foundations. It's very inspiring to just see how people are able to take that next step forward.
Well, and hopefully gives people just a little bit of hope for the future.
Yeah. Yeah. We need that. We need so much of that right now. So
we do.
It's exponential what you're being able to provide. So yeah, this COVID, we're kind of used to that stillness, aren't we? And so we've kind of emerged out of this, but we're carrying with us so many other people that are grieving, relationships, all the loss of life. Just think of, they say 9 people grieves very significantly for every death. And you think of almost 1 million people in our country. So there's a lot of grief right now. And, unfortunately we've been swimming in it the last few years. So yeah, I know this podcast
we can help other people just a little bit.
So thank you. And thank you to Sarah and Meredith for
yes, to both of them actually
for the friendships. Yeah. So very good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. We are always looking for new show ideas. If you'd like to be a guest, know someone who'd be a great guest, or have a show idea, please email us at marcy@andysmom.com. Be sure to visit the webpage, andysmom.com, for more content, including Marcy's blog. There you can also sign up to receive updates via email. Together, let's work to inspire hope, one day at a time.